I think we're live now. It's showing streaming live on YouTube.
Yep.
Okay,
Chairman.
Sorry about that, folks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this online meeting of the Planning Committee on Thursday, the 22nd of October 2020. I am the Chairman, Councillor Cyril Liddy. This meeting is being broadcast live via Zoom over the internet and on the Council's YouTube channel. It will also be available to watch afterwards. To begin the meeting, there are a few housekeeping matters. With the exception of the Democratic Services officers advising us, would all participants please mute their microphones unless invited to speak? At the start of the meeting, I will announce by name and invite to speak those participants wishing to make representations to the committee in the order of the business to be conducted. I will ask for the application to be presented by the planning case officer, during which time a visual presentation will be shared. I will ask committee members in turn if they wish to ask a question or make a comment. At the end of each item of business, the Democratic Services officer will ask each committee member in turn to confirm audibly how they wish to vote, and the outcome of each vote will be confirmed by the officer. Subject to the progress of the meeting, I may adjourn it at 8 p.m. for a short break. This is a quasi-judicial committee which makes decisions based on material planning considerations following the laws of the land and the policies of the council. If the committee is minded to refuse an application, members will use such considerations and evidence that will stand up in a court of law. The material planning considerations are listed in the committee's agenda. I will now ask committee members to introduce themselves in turn to confirm that they understand the procedures for the meeting. Starting with Councillor Barton, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Lynn Barton, Vice Chair, Shrub End Ward, and understood. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Chua.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Chua, St Anne's and St John's Ward. Understood. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hazel.
Councillor Pauline Hazel, Shrub End Ward. Understood.
Thank you. Councillor Moore.
Councillor Patricia Moore, Mersey and Pyfleet. Understood.
Thank you. Councillor Loveland.
Councillor Loveland, Tiptree Ward. Understood.
Thank you. Councillor McLean.
Councillor Jackie McLean. Understood.
Thank you. Councillor Gerard Oxford.
Councillor Gerard Oxford, Highwoods Ward. Understood.
And Councillor Warnes, please.
Councillor Martin Warnes, Beerchurch Ward. Understood.
Thank you. So the substitutes this evening are Councillor Moore for Councillor Jarvis and Councillor Gerard Oxford on behalf of Councillor Philip Oxford. There are no urgent items scheduled for this meeting. Are there any declarations of interest? Thank you. For each application, I will announce speakers by name in turn. Those in opposition will be heard first, followed by those in support, who each will be allowed to speak for 3 minutes. Then any visiting councillors will be allowed to speak for up to 5 minutes. The Democratic Services officer will announce when the allotted time has elapsed and speakers must stop at that point. Once all representations have been made, I will ask visiting speakers to leave the meeting. The remainder of the meeting will be available to view on the Council's YouTube channel. Now we have the first item. There are 2 items tonight. One is St Peter's Church at Birch, and the other one is land at Queen Street. For the first item, 7.1, I have public against Reverend Lydia Smith, public for Mr. Gary Cotty, visiting councillors, Councillor Andrew Ellis and Councillor Kevin Bentley. For the land at Queen Street, I have public against Mr. Dorian Kelly, Sir Bob Russell and Ms. Rowena Macaulay. I have no members of the public for, and the visiting councillors are Councillors Dundas and Crow. Right. Now, starting off with the speakers for the St. Peter's Church, item 7.1 on the agenda. We have, first of all, public against Reverend Lydia Smith. You have 3 minutes to address the committee, please.
I'm the local parish priest and the chair of the PCC, and I'm supported in my comments by the diocese. I'm aware these plans are viewed in a variety of ways by the communities of Birch and Lair Breton, and I accept that the authorities should give considerable weight to the public benefit arising from partial preservation of a Grade 2 listed building. However, this must be balanced against other material planning considerations. The wider concerns and objections of the PCC have been represented in written responses, and today I'm primarily going to comment on those aspects of these plans that impact on the day-to-day and long-term workings of this open churchyard. Traditionally, graveyards have been places of quiet contemplation. Church buildings can be successfully converted to residential use and coexist alongside graveyards. In most successful cases, this is where the graveyards become full and has been formally closed and is now maintained by the local authority. That means it's easier to plan the site layout to mitigate conflicts between residential use, visitors, and ongoing operational requirements. That's not the case here, where a residential property is planned within a working and open churchyard. There's a national shortage of grave space. Maintaining functional access to a burial ground is a matter of significant public interest. And the graveyard at St. Peter's has many decades worth of capacity and is a public amenity. The plans show access via the north side of the church, but this is unsuitable. The terrain in the area is sloping, and on the only level ground there, the graves are densely packed already. The proposed access route runs close to the north wall of the church, that's currently enclosed by security fencing, and that too has a high density of graves, including some recent ones from as recent as 1990, as well as some cremated remains. At the moment, access for grave digging vehicles, along with those used for general maintenance, is gained via the level ground at the south side of the church. In the plan, that's designated as private garden. We're also concerned about general parking and access for those attending graveside funerals or visiting graves. The parking provision in the site plan, as submitted, conflicts with the red line plan as it indicates development, that's the parking space, outside the application site. Further, as regards the archaeological study and the bat survey, more detailed investigation should have been made prior to the determination of these applications. Neither of these issues have been effectively addressed, but rather left to the conditions. And in the case of the bat survey, where the species of bat hasn't even been established, it's not legal to make detailed survey work the subject of a planning condition. We argue that the plans as submitted shouldn't be approved. But if they are to be approved, the issues I've just outlined should be resolved first, rather than leaving them to be addressed through the conditions.
Thank you, Reverend Smith. I call on Mr. Gary Cotty, please, to address. You have 3 minutes, please.
I'm Gary Cotty, the applicant. My family and I first expressed an interest in purchasing St. Peter's Church in April 2013, with the intention of converting it into becoming a family home for ourselves. More than 7 years later, and after considerable effort, we remain totally committed to saving this building. In preparing our proposals, we have sought the assistance of one of the country's premier conservation architects, and will continue to work with Purcell to ensure that we can be proud of this project. Our proposals represent the only scheme of retention. Once the building is restored, we believe that it will enhance the appearance of the conservation area and the churchyard. To further protect the building, and as part of any future purchase, we would seek to include a covenant limiting its use to that of a single dwelling. Early on in this process, it became apparent that a few local residents were against our proposed conversion of the building. To gauge the extent of this sentiment, we conducted a door-to-door survey. The survey asked simply whether the person supported our plans to convert the building into a single dwelling, or the Church Commissioner's plan to demolish the building, installing a garden of remembrance. The results of our survey were 85.3% in favour of our proposal, 13.7% in favour of the Church Commissioner's proposal, the balance declining to comment. Some parish councillors have sought to characterise our survey as biased. but have been unwilling to say how. To question the councillors on this supposed bias, I attended a public council meeting. However, no details were forthcoming at the time. At that meeting, the council voted to carry out their own survey. My understanding is that this has not been carried out. Furthermore, in 2018, we sought the parish council's involvement in a joint survey to mutually agreeable wording. The council declined to participate in this or any further survey. Access to the church is along a private shared driveway, which cannot be legally parked in front of. There are no parking restrictions on School Hill other than directly in front of the school gates. Some concern has also been raised regarding increased traffic movements during the conversion work. To mitigate against this, we will submit as part of the construction method statement a traffic management plan, limiting the movement of construction traffic during school start and finish times. Regarding the crypt within the existing building, it is proposed that this will be relocated in discussion with the Round family, who have previously indicated their willingness to see it moved if consent is given. Objection to our application was raised on the grounds that, and I quote, the new dwelling would require demolition of the church and the construction of a new dwelling very close to a graveyard that is very much still in use. This is incorrect. The proposal actually requires only partial demolition of the existing building, well away from the active part of the graveyard. Our proposed construction work will be far less disruptive to activities in the active part of the graveyard than the Church Commissioner's scheme of complete demolition, with work to the retained north and east elevations being primarily limited to conservation of the existing building envelope. The finished building will have no opening windows facing directly onto the open graveyard and will include elements of secondary glazing within, which will assist in mitigating against sound nuisance. That's the total of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cotty. I call on Councillor Ellis, please. Could you mute your microphone, please, Mr. Cotty?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry.
Sorry, thank you, Chairman and members. I'm actually going to read a presentation from Birch Parish Council, if I may. The Parish Council's fundamental objection to the proposed development is that conversion of the church to a large 5-bedroom family home is not appropriate within the churchyard, which remains open for burials. A large family home with its associated domestic activities will adversely impact on the peace and quiet that should prevail in a place where burials take place and people come to visit the graves of departed loved ones. In their report, planning officers appear to attach very little weight to local objections and concerns. During public consultation on the planning applications, in addition to objections from the parish council and church bodies, detailed objections were submitted by 22 local residents and others with relatives buried in the churchyard. Only 2 local residents, a husband and wife, wrote in support of the proposed development. The team vicar of the parish has highlighted major issues relating to access to the open churchyard. The proposed enclosed garden to the south of the building would result in closing off the access required for funerals and churchyard maintenance machinery. The parish council shares the church's concerns about access. A matter that comes out very clearly in the planner's report is the consistent failure of the applicants to supply more detailed information about their proposals in response to requests from planning officers, the church commissioners, and the diocese and the Victorian Society. The planning officers have felt it necessary to address the lack of response to requests for further information by recommending the attachment of so many conditions, there are 10 pages of them, to planning approval should set alarm bells ringing for members of the planning committee. Planning officers argue that whether the applicants have the resources to undertake the works is not a planning consideration. That may be so for most planning applications, but the parish council believes it must be a consideration in this case. A private individual is proposing a major project involving a large building known to have severe structural problems. That sits in the centre of a conservation area. The former Archdeacon of Colchester, in her letter of the 20th of September 2018 to the Borough Council, said, for the LPA to conclude that the harm to the church through partial demolition and conversion is acceptable, they are required under NPPF 2018 to be certain that the project is viable and can be completed. The church commissioners have long had concerns about the financial viability of the proposed development. They have expressed a very real concern that if the scheme was allowed to go ahead, once partial demolition and repair was commenced, the project would founder and be abandoned. That concern is shared by Birch Parish Council and local residents. Several sections of the Planning Officer's report refer to the church's spire and its importance as a feature in the landscape. No one would be happy to see this landmark disappear. However, there is a real fear that if the applicants commence their proposed development, a point will come when they argue that restoration of the spire is not practical for technical and/or financial reasons. The Planning Committee need to take full account of this very real possibility and the consequent impact on the open churchyard and the wider conservation area. Proper safeguards and provisions need to be put in place for completion of the restoration of the tower and spire in the event of the applicant's failure to complete it. That's from the Parish Council, and members, is actually a very real concern. The Parish Council, Councillor Bentley and myself have consistently said to our planning officers that a bond or some similar instrument of guarantee ought to be in place prior to any work commencing on this conversion, if you were minded to permit it. We've got no wish to see the spire lost, but for the reasons already given, and no doubt Councillor Bentley will expand on those, we don't believe conversion to a residence is a sensible or a viable solution. I hope the committee will take what the Parish Council and the Reverend Smith, speaking on behalf of the church, have to say into account in their decision making. Thank you very much indeed, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Ellis. Councillor Bentley, please.
Chair, members, thank you very much indeed. And like Councillor Ellis, I'm speaking on behalf of the Parish Council, but also a number of residents who've contacted us about this. And this is a matter that goes back nearly all my 19 years of being a borough councillor, and beyond that, when the dear late Peter Crowe also was around and involved in St Peter's. And it's a concern for all of us. And over the years, we have tried to find a resolution on this before Mr Cotty came along, and since he's come along as well. And it's true to say that everyone would like to preserve the spire. There is no question about that. For most people, it is the jumbo of the countryside. It can be seen for a long way away. It is a landmark, but it must be done in the proper way if we're going to do it. And risk, although it may not be a planning matter, I think is a real concern for people. Because is this going to be built in its entirety? Will the spire be preserved? And you might want to make that a condition to make sure it is. And worst case scenario, of course, it is half built and left, which, you know, is a possibility unless there is some proper investigation of the finances behind this. I don't question Mr Cotty at all on that, just I think proof needs to be given so everyone has comfort around that. I want to just press the point on funerals as well. Now, you've heard both from Mr Cotty and indeed from the Reverend and indeed from my colleague Councillor Ellis. Now, we have held meetings with the public who have loved ones there, and in some cases quite recently, and there has been real concern. If you're having a live funeral, that is actually taking place as opposed to visiting a loved one, if you have people who are coming along for a funeral, it is the most distressing time in most people's lives. You are then going to be asked to pass close by a house. This isn't a house set back, and yes, it's true, other church conversions have taken place, but actually funerals going past a house where people are occupying is not pleasant for everyone, I would have thought, but least of all the people who are mourning the loss of loved ones. And if you're coming to visit as well, it is also a concern in a graveyard that is still very much functional. We've heard about the vault, and there is a vault underneath. It contains the Round family, and if there is a deal that's been struck on that, that's fine, but that is a very serious consideration, because underneath the very architecture of the church sits that vault with loved ones in from years gone by. Now, the parking is a major issue. I could sit here for hours and tell you how terrible the parking is already. Never mind the construction traffic, parking generally with the school and other people. There's ongoing fights between people, verbally I have to say, between people about this issue. It's not going to get better with more people moving into that area. This is a cul-de-sac, if you've seen it, small cul-de-sac, and it gets busy twice a day with schools and other times as well. And this has done nothing to help that. And I would like to see actually what the ongoing plans are to make sure there's less cars in that area. But sadly, if this goes ahead, there'll be more cars. Now, as I say, we all would love to see the church preserved. It is a landmark. It's not very old, of course, and compared to many churches in our area, indeed the whole of the United Kingdom. But nonetheless, it is a church that's been there for well over 100 years. But the thing that strikes me as odd, and I hope it strikes you as odd as well, you've heard from the Reverend representing the church. The church are the people who would sell this to Mr. Cotty, the applicant, yet the church are speaking against it. So I'm not sure, are we going through some sort of strange exercise here? Because we could end up with the church not selling it to Mr. Cotty, then what? We've just had an application and all the involvement of that. I just thought that was something worth pointing out, that if you had the church fully for it, that would sound a bit different, but they're not, they're very much against it. And finally, I want to talk about this bond, because I think it's hugely important you've heard this. So to prevent, and I think it's a sign of good faith actually, to prevent this ever being in a state where it is half built, not finished, taking too long, whatever the case may be, for the people living there, for Mr. Cotty as well, let's have a bond up front that if the worst came to the worst, the building could be completed. So I would strongly urge you, in your conditions, if you are minded to approve, that bond is a major part of it as well. That would give peace of mind, I think, to you as members of the planning committee. It would give peace of mind to the borough, and I think above all it would give peace of mind to the residents. This is a very ancient village in Birch. This is a very big bone of contention. Everyone wants to see it sorted out, but it must be done in the correct way that I think benefits the people who live there. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bentley. I'll now move on to the public speakers for the land at Queen Street. Excuse me. First speaker, Mr. Dorian Kelly, please. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I hope I'm not going to be wasting your time, because I'm sure that the committee and ourselves, the people I represent, we're all fundamentally going to be singing from the same hymn sheet here. I think as a quasi-judicial, democratically accountable committee, you're being put into an invidious position. You're being asked to endorse what will be, in the end, a delegated decision, but you'll be shouldering responsibility for something that I think everybody is uncomfortable with. It's also a breaking of the Chinese wall between planning and the LPA. Putting aside the fact this is not an application, there's been no public notice, no consultation period, no real opportunity to place an objection on the case file. Asking the committee to pass an opinion, which is basically what it is at best questionable. But if you must proceed, we know, don't we, that both options are untenable, and you can't, in all conscience, put your imprimatur on either. But what a choice! Between making a hole the size of a London bus in the heritage wall, dismissively referred to as only early 18th century, and a ramp that the officer's report has admitted is unsafe, but recommends it anyway, which raises all sorts of questions. Now think of the legal consequences if a wheelchair tips over backwards or a blind person fell off the place there isn't a guardrail. Culpable or reckless endangerment is just a start. Information about the unsolvable ramp situation has been very hard to come by because of our old catch-all friend commercial confidentiality, combined with no plans being made available to us. But through information received, we understand that the representatives of the borough have gone into a huddle with the developers and agreed with them to try and circumvent the planning inspector's firm ruling, a Grampian condition, that disabled ramp shall, that's a legal term not capable of interpretation, shall be designed in accordance with BS 8300. And but they want to just ignore it and fob us off with something which no guardrail, and probably, as again, we haven't seen any drawings, is steeper than the maximum slope, perhaps the dangerous one in 15, as offered in the discarded option 1, which option 2 is based on. As for option 3, there's been enough heritage losses for essential development already. The total loss of 20 metres of the wall for Culver and Red Lion, the destruction of the Cups, the Corn Exchange, etc., St Nicholas. People haven't forgotten that after all these years or forgiven it. The loss of another 4.5 metres is the last straw. So on balance, I'm going to ask you to reject both option 2 and option 3, and recommend the officers ask the third-party developers to solve their own design problems and come up with something safe and legal that doesn't involve destruction of heritage, and do it without the aid and comfort of the borough to design it for them, and tell them what they should have said long ago, is that developers must present and publish a finished plan for impartial consideration, a plan which fully conforms with the whole of Grampian Condition 15. And if they can't, then planning permission fails. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. If you could mute yourself now, please. Thank you. Ms. Macaulay, please.
Thank you. I urge you not to vote for option 2 today for the following reasons. I see it as going against the judgment of the appeal inspector in opting for a design which does not fully meet the safety standards of BS British Standard 8300. This is a ramp that all parties agree is already a long and a high one at 4 flights, a fact which surely creates an argument for optimum safety in other respects. Yet it is this aspect to be compromised in the lack of full guarding at the upper turning point. It is not good enough to say that there are other options for disabled users, say this as a chair user myself, because the alternatives via Queen Street are really poor. And first-time users of the ramp, like visitors to Colchester, will have no advance reason to think they may have difficulty using it. So they may not have the option of choosing any alternative in any respect. Secondly, I urge you not to take any decision without the benefit of proper plans in front of you, and similarly available to us, public, so that we can fully visualise and understand the impact of the proposals and the alternatives and be able to comment in an informed way. The planning conditions state that prior to approval, the submitted scheme shall include detailed drawings. From this, I take it that you do have these. It would be good to clarify, because 2.2 of the committee report says the applicant is now drawing up detailed design proposals, implying they may not yet be realised and that you are preparing to make a decision without them. Either way, they don't appear to be in the public domain, meaning that not everybody here who has a right to have input has the benefit of full and equal information. At the appeal last year too, we asked for plans and had only tiny artist impressions available to us. Today's report also refers to 2 access consultants who have looked at this scheme since then, yet we do not have the benefit of proper feedback from them. Why are we not able to hear from them directly on such an important issue? And why is the committee not appointing an access consultant as opposed to the developers who have a vested interest? There are also gaps in the text of the report. The level change at the ramp location is given as at least 1.5 metres. If the planned ramp entails 4 flights, each with a gradient of 1 in 15 over 5 metres, then the rise of each flight will be 1/3 of a metre, and the overall rise of the 4 flights will be 1.3 metres, i.e. short of the required total rise, even if it was only 1.5, a maximum. Exactly what would the shortfall be then, and how would it be dealt with? We need to know these things. Finally, the report's advice in respect of the proposals meeting the Equalities Act, I regard as vague and misleading. The Equalities Act concept of reasonableness is about determining what additional adjustments might be made in support of people with protected characteristics. It is not there to justify departure from guidance that is in place to protect their safety. For these reasons, without access to plans, without a full report from our access consultant, in a situation safety of the most vulnerable users is the issue, please exercise great caution and vote against. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Macaulay. Jan, you have a statement from Sir Bob Russell, please.
Yes, I do. So, Chairman, members of the Planning Committee, it is not the role of the Planning Committee to choose the lesser of 2 evils. Options before the committee do not comply with legislation relating to disability access. Therefore, the options should be rejected. No ifs, no buts. It is one thing to recognise that there are occasions with existing buildings where it is not possible to provide disability access which is fully compliant, but there is no excuse, no justification in a new development for disability access to be compromised with a substandard level of access which is not fully in accord with planning legislation. There is no wriggle room in the legislation when it comes to new developments. There was no wriggle room given by the Planning Appeal Inspector when, as a specific condition for disability access, he allowed the appeal for the development on the site of the former bus station. Those who attended the planning appeal hearing will recall the strong case put by Councillor Gerard Oxford during those proceedings. What consultations have there been with organisations which represent the interests of those with disabilities? Normally, it is a delegated matter for officers to determine conditions. This is the first time I can recall that councillors have been asked by officers to determine a specific planning condition, disability access. I suggest this is because officers are fully aware that the options do not comply with planning legislation. It would be a breach of their professionalism to say yes to something which they know should be a no. I suggest that councillors should be very firm and give a resounding no to the options put forward by the developers. It is for the developers to come up with a scheme where all conditions are fully in accord with planning laws and regulations. For the committee to knowingly approve something that they know is not compliant with planning law would be aiding and abetting a wrong. The committee was unanimous when last year it refused the planning application for this development. One of the specific reasons was disability access. Therefore, the committee would be consistent in refusing to accept the options before members, because to do otherwise would be to allow a development to proceed in the full knowledge that disability access is in breach of the planning legislation. Finished.
Thank you. I now invite all public speakers and visiting councillors to leave the meeting and follow the proceedings via the council's YouTube channel, please.
Chairman, you have visiting councillors for this item too, so Councillor Crowe and Councillor Dundas.
I do indeed, and I do apologise for that. Thank you. Well, Councillor Dundas, please.
We'll forgive you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think actually the two members of the public have made many of my points, but I shall proceed anyway. I was on the original committee which considered the application and rejected it. We discussed at great length the poor disability access, and also the generally poor idea of the main loading and offloading, particularly of arriving and departing students being in Priory Street, where we rather felt the whole scheme looked a recipe for chaos and disaster on busy days. I feel we're sort of in some sort of parallel universe where there are increasingly desperate attempts to make something which was poorly conceived and fundamentally impossible in the first place work. In my view, it can't and it won't ever do so. So the committee is apparently faced with two options, option 2 and option 3. And I have to say, I do agree with the public statement just made. I do find it very poor that the detailed design of the two options aren't included in the original agenda or document pack. There's not even a picture of them as far as I can see. There's just a vague map. So it's actually very difficult, I think, for members and members of the public to actually find and study them in good time and know what they're judging. So option 3, according to the planning inspector, it's marginal in terms of wheelchair access and, to quote, maybe too much for some wheelchair users. On top of that, it punches a near 4-metre hole in the town wall. It does apparently comply just about with the Disabilities Act, but it's clearly suboptimal in terms of disability access and destructive on the heritage front. So it's not very good. Option 2 doesn't even get close to providing proper disabled access that I can see, and relies on the heritage argument to try and circumnavigate the Disabilities Act. The agenda pack states that the recommendations in the Act only apply, or to be able to ignore them, only apply in case of scheduled monuments, registered parks and gardens, registered battlefields and conservation areas. I actually don't think this is any of these. It is a very, very modern building and a modern development. And ironically, one of the reasons it was refused in the first place was because of the fact that it was a very modern looking building. It is basically a clean sheet design on an almost empty piece of land. The only monument aspect is that the main vehicular access drop off, plus most of the disabled parking and access, have been chosen as part of the design to be below an ancient wall. So if that doesn't work, then the fundamental plan is no good. So the committee is asked to endorse one of these options. I think the answer is simple. Neither option is any good. They both fail. I think it's pretty appalling, actually, that what is fundamentally a new build scheme cannot accommodate proper disabled access in the year 2020. If the current design doesn't allow it, they need to go back to the drawing board. With regard to the inspector's report, he doesn't actually endorse the solutions wholeheartedly. If you read the report carefully, it has a sort of Mr. McCorber-ish, something will turn up about it. He describes the idea of finding a solution as every prospect. That isn't the same thing as him saying there's a solution. Thus far as nothing has turned up, there doesn't seem to be every prospect. Neither of the options is a prospect. So committee, please don't endorse option 2, don't endorse option 3. This isn't a planning application where you're asked to review material planning matters. You seem to be being asked for an opinion to cover decisions made elsewhere. It's not your problem that the options don't work. The developer has that problem. They need to go back to the drawing board, and if there isn't a solution, they can't proceed. State clearly you do not consider either appropriate and you do not wish to endorse them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dundas. Councillor Crowe, please.
Thank you, Chair. Colchester seems to have something of a history of knocking big holes in the town wall. There are many other instances, but the ones that stick in my mind the most are in what is now the Priory Street car park, where Oliver Cromwell's attacking forces breached the Roman wall during the siege of Colchester. In more recent times, we've seen a large hole made in the 1970s to accommodate the Lion Walk shopping precinct underground loading bay, an exercise that was repeated again in the mid-80s to build a similar underground loading facility for the shops in Culver Square. Here we are now, in the supposedly more enlightened times of the 21st century, faced with a Hobson's choice about exactly how big a hole to make in the Roman wall. The choice is whether to knock a 4.5 metre hole in a 19th century stretch of the historic town wall, whilst the other option makes a smaller 1.9 metre that may not even be accessible by all those who wish to use it, because the access would not conform to British Standards guidelines on disabled access. Accessibility for the disabled using a ramp from the Priory Street car park is one of the very reasons why this planning committee rejected this unwanted scheme for 336 student rooms and a budget hotel in the first place. Yet here we are now, having come full circle, and you're being asked to consider an option that has not moved that argument forward one single inch. Or you can choose an option to knock another huge 4.5 metre wide hole in our town wall, like in Vineyard Street and St John Street, causing considerable harm to the character and appearance of this part of the town's conservation area. This is an option that places commercial gain over our town's unique history and heritage. The reasons why both options must be rejected tonight are clearly spelled out in the agenda, with neither option clearly having any more merit than the other. They're both as bad as each other. So the choice tonight is a simple one. Do we want to be a town that is inclusive for all? Do we want to protect our unique history and heritage? If the answer to both these questions is yes, because both of these are important to Colchester as a town whose primary concern is for its residents and to our visitors, I therefore implore the committee to kick both these options firmly into touch where they belong. I do not believe it is beyond the imagination and abilities of the applicant's architects to resolve this matter themselves, and it is not the committee's job to hold their hand and make it easier for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crowe. Now, if you, both you and Councillor Dundas, could leave the meeting. Thank you. The next item is item 6. We have minutes of meetings. The first one held on the 30th of July. Do I have a proposal? Are there a true and accurate record of proceedings? If so, could I have a proposer? Councillor Barton and a seconder. Councillor Chua. Thank you. All in favour? You just do
agreed.
it by show of hand. Agreed. Okay.
Agreed.
That's unanimous. The
Chair.
Councillor Warnes, please.
Yes, I'm unable to agree as I wasn't present at either meeting.
Thank you very much. Noted. And the minutes of the meeting of the 20th of August.
Sorry, Cyril, but Pat had her hand up. I think she wanted to say something.
I do beg your pardon.
Just to say that, like Councillor Warnes, I was not at either of the meetings, so cannot say one way or the other.
All right. Thank you very much. Do I have a proposer and a seconder? Proposer Councillor McLean, seconder Councillor Chua. All those in favour?
Yes.
Who attended
Agreed.
the meeting?
Yes,
Right,
Agreed.
Agreed unanimously. Thank you very much. Now, moving on to the substantive part of the agenda. 7.1, St. Peter's Church. Demolition of majority of south aisle, retaining western gable wall. Renovation of retained building envelope, conversion to a single dwelling, including new reinforced concrete raft foundation, partial mezzanine, and new floors to tower. I ask Alistair if you would kindly present the application to the committee, please.
Right, can I just check that you can see that?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. As the councillor eloquently describes, the application is for the conversion of St. Peter's Church to a single dwelling, including the partial demolition of the south aisle, part of the demolition of the porch, and internal alterations. The application has been subject of a number of objections, as you have heard, and has been called in by Councillor Bentley on the grounds that it would require the demolition of the church and the construction of a new dwelling close to a graveyard and would not afford appropriate privacy to those using the churchyard and on highway grounds in terms of highway impact and parking. The application site is situated in the centre of Birch to the west of the village green on raised ground. It is a Grade 2 listed building and currently on the Buildings at Risk register. It is also located in the Birch Conservation Area, which is also, and the Birch Conservation Area is also classed at risk due to the long-term threat to the future of the church. The church closed in about 1990 and has been vacant since that time and has deteriorated over that time. The church commissioners have published a draft scheme under the mission and pastoral measures seeking the demolition of the church. That proposal was subject to a non-statutory public inquiry, which was suspended to allow the current application to be considered. Should this proposal be unsuccessful, the church committees will restart their proposals to the demolition of the church. I'll just quickly give, I'm sure most members are familiar with the church, but I'll quickly give a whistle-stop tour around the area. This is the view from the school hill looking up towards the church. And then this is the view back from the church gate towards the main road running through Birch. This is standing with a back to the gate looking to the south of the church. This is the main church entrance. This is the south aisle. And this is the south side. And then this is looking to the north, the access up through around the cemetery on that side. The image on the left is the north aisle, and the image on the right is a photograph of the rear of the church. It's another image of the rear of the church. And then this is the standing in the area that's proposed for the domestic garden of the church. So what you can see through the trees is the south aisle, which will be demolished as a part of the proposal. Internally, at present, there's scaffolding has been erected to ensure the church roof doesn't collapse as it suffered from extensive water leak damage. I'm standing in the north aisle. The entrance to the church, the west entrance to the church is to the right, and the south porch is straight ahead. This is standing looking towards the north aisle. Standing in the middle of the church, looking back towards the entrance. It's another image of the south aisle and the nave arcade to the left. Another image of the internal interior of the church. That's that. And as a couple of you have already mentioned, the church is quite prominent in views. This is taken from the west of the east of the church. So that sets out the proposals of the conversion of the church into a dwelling house. That will involve the demolition of the south aisle, which is in this location, which will be kept as a low-level wall, creates a terrace. And then internally, you have a mezzanine floor being inserted in the north aisle and part of the nave arcade. I've provided a full report setting out all the main issues and main considerations. However, it's worth highlighting a number of the number of the points that have been raised. First is about inappropriate development and closing off parts of the church to the general public. Both the church commissioners and the Chelmsford Diocese have confirmed that there's not an objection in principle to residential use. The concerns that they are raised have been on specific factors, mainly the proximity of the church to the main entrance to the churchyard and how access will be maintained for ongoing working of the churchyard. It is worth noting that the extent of the domestic curtilage, which is outlined in yellow on this plan, was agreed as a part of the statement of common ground between the church commissioners and the applicant as a part of the public inquiry. So, notwithstanding that, the church commissioners also accept that the south side forms the logical area for the garden of the proposed church. The office, as I set out in the report, it's the opinion of officers that the access to the rear of the church for the ongoing maintenance of maintenance of the churchyard and for ongoing burials is best agreed between the church commissioners and the applicant themselves in agreeing the precise route. This could be achieved, for example, by creating a pathway around the edge of the site that's enclosed by a hedge, thereby permitting all access to the rear of the active church, which is in this area here. Notwithstanding that, a condition has been recommended requiring details of access to be provided. In that way, we can ensure that the scheme is designed in a suitable manner. Impact on burials has been another consideration raised by a number of the objectors. At present, there are burials to the north and northeast of the church, which are currently actively tended, but the main area for future burials is located in this sort of area here. The diocese has advised that there's considerable space for future burials, and it's therefore clear that these will continue for some time to come. The applicant fully accepts the need to be respectful to burials, and that the scheme has been designed in order to safeguard the immunity and privacy of people using the churchyard. There is specific legislation relating to burials, which requires those burials that within the area proposed for the dwelling to be reinterred, unless the Ministry of Justice issues a dispensation order. This will need to be done prior to the sale of the land, and the applicant would need to be involved with the church commissioners in agreeing how that is undertaken. The applicant has, however, agreed that the removal of the burials in the crypt, that he's happy for that to happen and for those to be reinterred within the churchyard. A number of the comments have stated that the church is not of architectural interest. It's important to note that the building is, as a Grade 2 listed structure, has been identified as national interest. Another criticism of the scheme is that it is not viable, and questions have been raised over whether the applicant has the resources to fulfil the scheme. Officers believe that this is best dealt with, but as a part of the sale of the land to the applicant. The church commissioners can impose conditions and requirements on the applicant in order requiring it to be implemented within a set time frame, and have escrow accounts or other such bonds in place to ensure that should the applicant proceed and then fail to complete the scheme, that the church is either demolished or the conversion scheme is completed. Parking has been raised as an issue of concern. The application proposes a parking area in this location for the proposed dwelling house, and the applicant has offered additional parking in this area here for the users of the church. The scheme complies with the adopted parking standards in terms of it will provide 2 parking spaces for the residents. And the Highway Authority has confirmed that the scheme will not create an issue in terms of highway safety or capacity on the local road network. The test, as members will be aware, in determining or in refusing application of highway grounds is that the development must have a severe impact on the road network. The construction method statement has been proposed as a part of the planning permission, and that would enable the applicant enable officers to control when deliveries are undertaken to ensure there's not a direct conflict with the opening and closing of school times. Comment has been made that bat surveys have not been undertaken, and therefore we do not know the presence of bats. The application is accompanied by an ecological statement, and that identifies that bats are known to be within the church, and both common pritisel and soprano pritisel have been identified as being resident within the church. We therefore do know that there are churches, the bats are present within the church. The report that's submitted outlined a number of mitigation measures that would be required, and having spoken directly to the ecologists that undertook the works, officers are confident that the scheme can be adequately mitigated without having an adverse impact upon bats. For this reason, a condition is being recommended requiring an up-to-date survey to be undertaken, a full mitigation scheme to be proposed as a part of prior to any works commencing, and that any mitigation scheme is thereafter monitored for a period of 5 years to ensure that the bats have not been adversely affected. Archaeology, or the lack of current surveys, has also been identified as a concern. It is known that the site is an archaeologically sensitive area, and the scheme has been designed proposing a raft foundation to minimise impact on ground disturbance. Having been in the church and having looked at the site, officers are confident that the raft foundation can be implemented without having an adverse impact on buried archaeology. If you cannot, the height of the building is such that if you can't go down into the ground, you can raise the raft foundation up slightly and thereby maintain the relevant floor level within the church without affecting the archaeological resource. For the reasons set out in the report, officers have recommended approval. Thank you very much. Presentation's finished.
Thank you. Could you clear the screen? Thank you. Yeah. Right, thank you very much. I will now invite members of the committee if they wish to ask a question or make a comment, please. Councillor Barton, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. My understanding is that a former application was actually looking at total demolition of this building, and that would definitely destroy this wonderful birch landscape that we have at the moment. So balancing it with that, surely this application would actually save the church, because we're only losing the south aisle and the porch. They're the only parts of the church that would be demolished. So the main structure of this grade 2 listed building would still be there. And I would want clarification that the spire was remaining, because obviously that is central to the landscape as well. So could you confirm really that conditions are in place to safeguard this grade 2 listed building, and that all important features will actually be retained, like the window, for example? And finally, I note that Historic England is supporting this. They see it as the only sustainable opportunity to save the building. And let's face it, it's been unused for 27 years. So I do happen to agree with them that that is the only sustainable option on the table. But I would finally want to just check that we safeguard access to the churchyard for maintenance. And those are my thoughts at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I will do the, Alistair, I will do the councillors' questions in groups of 3. So I'll move on to Councillor Chua, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Like Councillor Barton, I'd like to know about the stained glass and the tile, work in the church, where it's going. Is it going to be preserved, and kept or used elsewhere? And my other question is, if I hear correctly, the parking are 2 parking spaces for the residents. And is there another parking space next to it for use of the church? Can I have that clarified, unless I'm not hearing it properly? Thank you.
And Councillor Hazel, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to know actually who owns this land. It would appear that it's Church Commission property. And if it is, why is it up for sale? Why, given the Church Commissioners want it to be retained for community use, why has this application come forward? So I'm confused about that. I would also, the graveyard, there are graves around the entire church. It's not just one side or the other. I have walked around there. I do know the church from many, many years association with it. And I am not sure how those graves could be protected from this development. Then there is, of course, we hear that the tombs in the crypt will be removed, and will the plaques also, but there's also the question of the most magnificent stained glass windows. What's going to happen to them? I mean, there's so many questions, and of course the spire. So I'd like to hear from the rest of the committee to see what comments are being made. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Moore, you have your hand up.
I do. It's only a request to speak, but if you're
what I do is I go through them in order, so I will come to you. Yeah.
Fine.
Alistair, if you'd care to address those that cluster of concerns.
That's fine. Yes, the church commissioners, or the church was repaired redundant in about 1990, and there have been a number of sort of abortive proposals for its conversion. And the church commissioners have put in an application for the demolition of the church, because after sort of 20, 30 odd years, no proposals come forward. That's currently held in abeyance pending the outcome of this application. So that's the issue about the church. The church commissioners who are responsible for redundant churches are saying that if we can't find a use for this building, then they will look to demolish the church. The proposal retains the church spire and the sort of the nave, the chancel, and the north aisle. And there are a suite of conditions that are designed to protect historic features within the building. There's a requirement to undertake archaeological investigation works before anything starts, so we can secure the buried, ensure that there's no damage to buried archaeology. There's a condition requiring the safeguard historic building recording to be undertaken, and following that, there's a requirement to safeguard old features that are identified as being important. The windows in the west, east, and north sides of the building are being retained, so the stained glass will be retained in situ in those. Obviously, the demolition of the south porch will entail the loss of those windows. However, again, the condition says if they're identified as being historically important, then there needs to be a proposal for their reuse or their relocation as appropriate. That also includes within the church there are a number of memorials attached to the wall. The report sets out that one in the south aisle is of particular note, and the proposal is that that would be relocated within the main body of the church. The maintenance issue, as I set out in the report, that is probably best resolved between the people selling the land, or as the church selling the land, and the applicant themselves, rather than the council seeking to dictate where that maintenance should go. There is free access on the north side with that, and there's no development or paths or anything being put in on that side, so access to the north side will remain as is. Officers are aware that concern has been expressed that the gradient of the land is perhaps not suitable for all users on that side. And therefore it is likely that some form of access will be required on the south side of the church, and there's a condition that requires that to be agreed before the garden area is used for domestic purposes, and suitably designed in terms so it integrates fully with the surrounding area. There was comment made about graves being on both sides of the church and grave markers being on both sides of the church. That is correct. The south side is where most of the historic church graves are, and there's a condition that requires the relocation, the identification and the relocation of grave markers on that side. And as I explained in the presentation, there is quite specific legislation that needs relating to disturbing of burials on the within the church itself. As the legislation stands, it's my understanding that all burials should be removed prior to the land being transferred out of ecclesiastical use. If that is not the case, then there is scope for an application to the Ministry of Justice, who can give dispensation for graves to remain in situ. So that is very much outside the scope of planning, that process, but there are obviously safeguards in place to ensure burials are not unduly disturbed. In terms of parking, the proposal is for, as you go into the church on the south side, there will be, as currently shown, a gate that will provide access for parking for the applicant's family. And then to the front of the tower area, there's an area of hard landscaping being suggested, that the applicant has said that if the church was to use that for the parking of hearses or visitors to the church, then they're happy to provide that should they want it. I know some of the comments from the diocese have said they've got concerns over the gradient of that land and they don't think it's usable. Ultimately, it is something being offered on by the applicant as a part of this proposal. If the ground levels prove not to be acceptable in terms of use for a hearse, for example, the hearses don't currently access the churchyard, so there'll be no change in circumstance. It was a benefit being offered by the applicant to help them with the future operation of the church. In terms of the church for sale, why is the diocese selling it? Back in the 1990s, the church decided to declare this particular church redundant, and obviously as a listed building, they have a obligation to try and secure a future use of the building to safeguard the heritage asset. And this is why it's being marketed over a period of time for an alternative use. And residential is obviously one of the uses that these buildings are now put to. I think that's everything, Chairman.
Thank you, Alistair. Councillor Moore, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, several of my concerns have already been addressed, but in order, the access to the churchyard, I know they're saying that the gradient is not suitable on the north side, but it would be nice if there was a pedestrian access at least, and I'm sure that many mountain dwellers would tell you can go along, you can traverse a hillside without too much problem. It's not beyond the wit of man to level a path there, simply because if there's a grave on the north side and somebody's got to walk all the way around the south side to get to it, that's asking a bit much. So I would have thought a simple pedestrian access on the north side of the church ought to be doable. I'd like to see that. About this business of a private dwelling in a churchyard. Now, I know it will be surrounded on three sides, or two sides, in fact, because the garden will be on one of those three sides. There are many, many examples of private dwellings right adjacent to churchyards. I mean, he said all town churchyards always had private dwellings right up to the edge. And in fact, where all these rectories have been sold off, many of them are virtually in the churchyard. So I think with the layout as it is, and I gather it does seem to be an understanding that privacy for the churchyard is going to be taken into account. I think probably when it settles in, I think there will not be a problem about there being a dwelling there. I would most definitely like to see the archaeological trench go through because of the older church that's mentioned in the archaeological. I'd have to hunt through the details, but there's a suggestion that a trench should be dug to check on the older church building that was there, see if there's anything vital. I presume that's outside and not inside. I'd like to see that done. And again, I would say we must make certain that the stained glass
and other things of importance inside are either in situ or protected. The alternative to this scheme, and I start from a position where I'm never happy with churches being used as anything other than churches. But the fact is, this is either going to be a dwelling or it's going to be demolished. And I would rather that it stood there, because it is a listed building. And it does seem that, having a look at the pictures at the outside, it's going to be quite easy on the eye. And where the alterations have been done, that seems to be perfectly acceptable. I'm not happy with the kitchen in the chancel. That's my personal feeling. I'd much be happier if the kitchen was not in the chancel. But I suppose that's not something that we can demand at this stage. There's no planning reason for it, that I'm well aware. And the fourth point is, bats. Yes, bats. If they demolish it, there'll be no roost for the bats. So I think that's probably a bit of a, not red herring, it's wrong. But anyway, you see what I mean. I think an awful lot of care has been taken into getting all the problems sorted beforehand. So I think, going back to my feeling that, yes, and a bond or something like that, so that we're not left with a half-built building would be good. Although, again, you go back to the notion, well, if it all fails, it gets demolished and we're back to where we would have been anyway. So I think perhaps we're in a, I won't say win-win, but the alternative, if we say no, I think we're in a much worse place. So it would get my support. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Loveland, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. Yeah, I had a few things I've written down. And one was, have we got any guarantee that these people have got the finance to do a project like this? Because this sort of project running to millions. This could start at 750,000 and go upwards. A bond is essential, something of that nature. And I understand the church will be demolished in any case. So I think anything we can do is, if they've got the finance, to agree it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Loveland. Councillor McLean, please.
Thank you, Chair. We need to be reassured, as everybody has said, that there is a bond in place, there is the finances in place, and that the authority can establish beyond reasonable doubt that the extent of demolition is justified to guarantee the future of the building. Because we need to know that they can preserve as much as possible, because it is, an amazing place to go and visit, although it's all boarded up. I did a site visit this week to see the graveyard still in working order, and it is, there's recent burials there. And I want to make sure everything's sympathetically done to remove gravestones around the entrance of the church, because there's a little 12 or 14-year-old boy that's buried there in, beautiful stonework. That needs to be preserved for that family. And, all the graveyards, round to the south, there are gravestones under the trees and things are going to have to be removed, and it's got to be done correctly and respectfully. I really would like the reassurance that this is going to be preserving the windows, the stained glass windows, the internals of the church. It's not going to change the structure out of all recognition. I mean, often we give permission and then there's amendments, there's changes. And so often you think you've agreed something which you can see, but it never comes to fruition. So I think, and I don't know how the planning department can do that, because really you can only do so much and it's out of the remit. I want to make sure that anybody visiting the site is felt it's going to be welcoming, It's not going to be intimidating for any funeral burials on the site. That it's going to have, you know, the feel of going to a graveyard without any animosity or any problems. You know, the parking is shocking, as we know, and it's always been like that in Birch because of the school. If they do have the odd parking space will be useful. But I don't know if it's going to help anybody going to the church. They will have to park in the usual manner for the graveyard. It is very restricted on going up to the premises, so I don't know how that's going to be enhanced because it is very, very narrow. I mean, I wouldn't say you would get a heavy goods vehicle up there with any deliveries, so I don't know how that's going to be incorporated into the build, or how they will get the goods up there for the building work. You know, we've got to, and there are very close to, you know, a couple of houses, and we, you know, be ashamed to ruin the green sward outside and cause, you know, detrimental harm to the surrounding area. And I would like all the artifacts of particular interest on the history of this site to be preserved, whether it's somewhere in Colchester or even somewhere that we can have some form of showing what has been before. So, and, you know, not lose any of the history to it. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McLean. Alistair, would you like to pick up on those points raised, please?
Yes, certainly. First, regarding access to the churchyard and the north side, the current arrangements don't change. That side, that part of the site falls outside the application site boundary, and the churchyard as is will essentially remain the same. The applicant has a small apron around the edge of the building that will be in his demise, but that is to be left as open space, and the churchyard itself will remain as is. If the church wished to put in a more formal path through that area, then obviously they can do that. But as I say, I think part of the charm of the churchyard is that it's a grassed area with gravestones, and I think that's probably the best how it should remain. I agree with Councillor Moore that there's no reason to assume that a residential building can't coexist with a working churchyard. There is conditions regarding archaeological excavations and investigations. It is known that the church was built on or virtually on top of the medieval church, so we know that, and there's obviously burials in addition to that in the area. The proposal is, having spoken to the archaeological officer, is to have a number of trial pits within the interior of the church to establish what is there, because that ultimately is where the main ground disturbance works potentially will take place in terms of inserting the raft foundation, and to have a excavation on the exterior of the church. However, most of the ground levels will remain as is, as it's intended, simply to grass that area over and maintain the trees in existing areas. So there should be no direct conflict. And yes, if the scheme fails, the Bats won't have a house in the fullness of time because the building will be demolished. Number of comments have been made about ensuring that a bond is in place. Officers have taken the view that that's probably best left to the sale of between the landowner selling the land and the applicant to ensure that that there is an appropriate bond in place, either that will cover the demolition should the project fail, or complete the project should that happen. Conditions have been attached regarding requiring a schedule of repairs and a phasing programme. Officers very much see that there will be a case of starting with the enveloping repairs to ensure the building is made wind and weather tight, followed by sort of the demolition of the south aisle, and then again made wind and weather tight with the new glazing to the south aisle. Once that is done, then obviously you need to make sure the stonework is fully repaired. How the work proceeds thereafter is more down to the applicant. I think as far as the local planning authority is concerned, we need to make sure the building is made wind and weather tight and safe from any further deterioration. Likewise, there's a condition on the planning permission requiring a survey of all grave markers to take place, and then for those to be relocated within the churchyard unless otherwise agreed, but in writing by the local planning authority. That's essentially being done to ensure that the history of the site is maintained, etc. Obviously, the church will have its own procedures in terms of how they are removed from an ecological perspective. Construction access is raised as a query question mark due to the narrow approach to the church. It's not unknown in historic areas for narrow entrances to be there and preventing large vehicles accessing them. What will often happen is it will be moved onto smaller lorries or forklifts and taken up. Again, the detailing of that can be adequately controlled through a constructive method statement. I think I've covered everything, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Oxford, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Most of my points have been covered, so I'm not going to repeat them. One I am interested in, if I'm right, I think Alistair said that there are 2 parking spaces for the residents for a 5-bedroom property. My personal experience in my ward, which is urban, so it's maybe different, is that if you've got a 5-bedroom property, over time, you're likely to have children grow up and each want their own vehicle as well. So 2 is not going to be satisfactory for a 5-bed property. Comments, please.
Thank you. Councillor Warnes, please.
Sorry, Chair. I have a dog barking. Let me sort the dog out and I'll come back.
All right then. Okay. I think for my own part, I am, aware of the sensitivities surrounding a change of use for what is consecrated ground or consecrated building. However, I think Councillor Moore is right. There are numerous examples where redundant churches have been reused as homes. I think that many of the concerns expressed by committee members are really more matters for private law, contract law, between the church commissioners, who are the vendors, and the applicant, particularly the issue of the bond and its impact on the question of viability. I do note that there is not quite a meeting of minds between the local incumbent and the diocese, but there's not much we can do about that. I think most of the issues surrounding the funerals and the viability and so forth, as I say, and the access can be dealt with by way of contract between the church commissioners and the applicant. Councillor Warnes, are you ready?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. As we've gone through the meeting, most of the concerns I've written down have actually been raised and adequately answered, and you just answered the last outstanding one. So I have nothing to add.
Thank you. Do you want to, Alistair, do you want to mop up on any of points raised, particularly Councillor Oxford's point about parking?
Yes. Having presented a number of items at committee, I fully appreciate parking is an emotive issue. We obviously have our adopted standards that would require 2 parking spaces and 0.25 thereafter for visitors parking. 2 parking spaces are provided. It is possible to extend further into the churchyard for hard surfacing for car parking. The problem with that is it takes away something of the character of the churchyard. having hard landscaping moving into the churchyard. So we've tried to keep it to the minimum necessary in that sense. Likewise, the comments regarding the bond and being private matters, etc. I've tried to keep the planning conditions to planning matters purely, and to avoid trying to cover for every eventuality, because I feel we'll be moving outside the scope of planning. It'll become a nightmare for planning to enforce and may not meet the requirements of others. I don't know if that helps at all.
Thank you, Alistair. That does clarify it. I mean, we do have to be fairly clear about the planning obligations we seek to impose. I think Councillor Barton stuck her hand up just before you, Councillor Hazel. So, Councillor Barton, please.
Thank you. I was just going to suggest that we actually accept the officer's recommendations.
Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Moore, thank you. Before we move to the vote, Councillor Hazel.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a couple more questions in regard. Mr. Day talks about the grave markers and graves being noted. And as Councillor McLean mentioned, the 14-year-old boy, his gravestone is very poignant, obviously, but it also is, in my view, very unusual because it has a cross which is incorporated into the stone, the whole length of the tomb. And I've never seen that anywhere. And yet across Birch Churchyard, there are many there's lots of the gravestones like that, bigger ones, smaller ones, and I think it's very unique. So I wouldn't like this young man's grave to simply be marked, sort of demolished and then marked somewhere in the graveyard. So will these graves be moved in their entirety? And the other question on the bond, if we approve this application and the applicant then says to the church commissioners he will not give a bond, what happens then? I know it may be outside planning, but I'd be interested to know the answer. Thank you.
Alistair, would you care to pick those up, please?
Yeah. The grave markers, the condition requires the relocation of the grave markers, because obviously they affect the setting of the listed building and the character appearance of the conservation area. In terms of the removal of the actual remains, as I said in the presentation, under normal circumstances, they are required to remove all burials within the churchyard prior to its changing out of ecclesiastical church use, unless they get dispensation from the Ministry of Justice. So what would normally happen is where there is ground disturbance works being planned, for example, services being put in or foundations being laid, etc., those graves or those remains of bodies would have to be relocated as part of the conversion works. Others that will not be disturbed, they would probably allow to be left in situ. I don't know whether that helps Councillor Hazel in that sense. And then in terms of the bond, I mean, I would assume that the church commissioners will be saying, unless the bond is in place, we won't sell the land. And if they won't sell the land, the application can never be implemented. And they'll then proceed to the application for the demolition of the church on the basis they've not been able to agree a contract to sell with the applicant, and they'll say there's no viable use for the building.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. Does that answer your questions, Councillor Hazel?
Yes, it does. I still feel I'm in between a rock and a hard place. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, we do have a motion to accept the officer's recommendations, and it's proposed and seconded. Richard, would you care to call out the school roll, please, for the vote, please?
Thanks, Chairman. I think Jan's going to administer the vote for you.
Yes, please.
I was ready with that. So, Councillor Barton?
4.
Councillor Chua?
4.
Councillor Hazel?
Abstain.
Abstain. Councillor Loveland?
4.
4. Councillor McLean?
Against.
Against. Councillor Moore?
4.
4. Councillor Oxford?
4.
Councillor Warnes?
4.
And Councillor Liddy?
4.
So that's 7 for, 1 against and 1 abstain. So that's carried.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to the second item of the agenda.
Chairman, just before you start, you won't be aware, but your image has frozen on the screen. I just wondered if you want to just turn your video on and off.
I mean, I'm quite happy to proceed if you don't mind my frozen face.
No, that's fine, Chairman. I just wondered if you want to just try and start your video again and see if that cured it, but it's fine.
No, I mean, you can hear me and I can see all of you, so we can proceed. Thank you for pointing that out. Right. Item number 8. And this land at Queen Street. And in this case, the report concerns the proposal for the southern pedestrian access that is required to be delivered as part of the approved alumni development. The recommendation is to endorse the approach to the creation of a new pedestrian access as set out in the report, namely that of option 2. I will ask Alistair as case officer to present the report to the committee, and I will then invite Simon to explain the background of this application and why it has been brought before the committee. So, Alistair, please.
Right. Hopefully that's sharing, is it?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes,
okay.
it is.
Yep. This is a slightly unusual application that's been brought to committee, and Simon will explain more fully, but officers are obviously aware of the contentious nature of this application and felt, given that there is a potential, I'm not sure conflict is the right word, but a jarring of the desire to achieve this an accessible access from this location and the potential damage to the town wall, we felt that a steer from members would be prudent in order to get in order to ensure that we're fully interpreting what the members' desires were in respect to this proposal. I'm sure everybody will remember the site. Obviously, it's in this location here to the east of the town centre. The area in question is, you've got Priory Street that runs through here. This section here that juts out from the town wall was built as a part of the theatre extension in the mid 19th century. It is not Roman in origin, although it's quite possibly reuses rubble from the area, because to the layperson it may well look like a part of the town wall. The town wall itself is to the east. It runs along this direction, and then the buried remains run in that direction as it moves across the site. Sorry. So this is the site in question at the moment. To say this is the rubbled remains of the wall, and then you've got more modern brickwork that's sat on top of it, and then I think it's a fire escape built into the building there. And if you've ever been into the building, I think these are gents' toilets on that side. The view from sort of the other side of the site is so that this is the town wall along here with the bus station built on top of the town wall, and then here we have the theatre extension and then the bus station extended. You've got different ages of brickwork above, so it's a hodgepodge in terms of building ages as you get further up the building. As I say, A steer is being sought from members in advance of a formal submission for the approval of details reserved by condition 15 that requires a southern access be provided in this location to serve the site and the wider environment to the north. It's important to note that the application doesn't reopen the debate regarding the merits of the scheme that was approved by the planning inspector, and members will also be aware of the planning inspector's report and the conclusions it derives from the acceptability of the scheme in terms of the access and how that should be provided. Condition 15 is the condition in question, and that requires a scheme for the inclusive access to be provided. And in the event that a scheme includes a ramp, this needs to be designed in accordance with the British Standard 3800, which is design of an accessible and inclusive built environment. It's important that members note that the British Standard is a guidance document which sets out ideal recommendations, and the document itself states that it does not override other legislative requirements. And it also states that when considering proposals in the historic environment, such as in a conservation area, then the recommendations can be applied more flexibly to ensure the historic environment is adequately protected. In considering the development proposal, decisions need to be aware of a variety of other pieces of legislation. You obviously have the Equalities Act that requires a reasonable response to be made to the provision of disabled access. You have the Buildings Regulations, which sets out under Part M how things like ramps and access should be provided. It's important to note, having spoken to the council's building control manager, they have advised that the building regulations wouldn't apply to the construction of the ramp because it's not deemed to be a building. However, they have also advised that may assist members in their deliberations, that where you have a ramp with a length that's 5 metres, a gradient to 1 in 15 is acceptable. They've also advised that even if that wasn't being provided, the regulations allow for deviation from the measures set out in the approved documents if a written access strategy is provided to explain why it can't be provided in a set location, and or how other mitigation works may be taking place to offset any shortcomings. Then you've obviously got the Planning Act, where there's a requirement to determine applications in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And we have obviously policies in relation to pedestrian access, DP1, that talks about need to provide designs of the site that where pedestrians are able to move freely, and that includes the provisions of disabled users, and DP17, which states that we should incorporate satisfactory and appropriate provision for pedestrians, including those with impaired mobility. Probably the final piece of statutory legislation is the Planning and Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act, which places a statutory duty on the decision maker to protect the setting of listed buildings and the character and appearance of conservation areas. In terms of the town wall, the wall is dual designated, so it's a Grade 1 listed building and a Schedule Ancient monument. Obviously, members will be aware that the town centre falls part of the town centre conservation area. Linked to the Planning Acts is obviously the MPPF, and that advises that we should be creating places that are inclusive and accessible. And in terms of heritage, it states that when considering proposals with heritage impact, great weight needs to be afforded to assets conservation, and the more important the asset, the greater the weight should be. Historic England have produced guidance in terms of accessibility in the historic environment, and their guidance talks about development and proposals having a proportionate response. So as you can see from rattling through the different pieces of sort of relevant legislation, there's quite a range of legislation, and not always will all legislation be everything will be singing in tandem. There may well be differences or divergences in relevant bits of legislation. Finally, the further consideration is obviously the planning inspectorate's decision letter, which sets out some key considerations when talking about the access, and I'll run through those when I get towards the end of the presentation. Both options have been designed in the light of the British standard, and the applicant has engaged a specialist access consultant who is a member of the National Register of Access Consultants. The council likewise have engaged the services of a specialist access consultant to advise them on the proposal, as this is quite a unique area or specialism. And we wanted, given the sensitivity of the site and the length that it was discussed at the planning inquiry and indeed at the planning committee, we wanted to ensure the proposals were fully in compliance with the guidance, with the recommended guidance. So this is what's known as referred to as option 2. It is similar to the proposal that was tabled at the planning inquiry. It proposes an opening that is aligned with the door that's existing, that's already there, which is in that sort of location, and extends the building, extends the opening to the west to create an opening, and it provides a ramped access that moves sort of in that location around. I'll provide this is a symmetric that helps to sort of give an indication of how it would work. So the access goes through, and let's say the opening is 2.2 meters wide. In the report, I've set out observations from our consultant who explains how he feels they meet the requirements of the recommendations as set out in the British standard. And as a general rule, he's comfortable that it complies with the recommendations. The area of concern relates to this area here, where the British standard talks about guard railing, where there's a change in levels, and I think it's quite important to note that there's a degree of subjectivity in the interpretation in relation to the British standard in this respect, where you have guard railing at intermediate landings. But what the guidance does state is that the risks should be properly assessed by the person designing the proposals. I've been advised there's no specific requirement to provide guard railing where the landing shares at the head of the stairs. Tactile paving will be provided under this option, as is required by the guidance. The designers have also undertaken a risk assessment and followed the statutory guidance under the Construction and Design Management Regulations. And they've also advised that it's not uncommon to find where you have shared landings and ramps to have no guard railing in this location. Now, this option provides the narrower of the two openings. They are, however, aware that there may be a desire to provide guard railing in this location. So they've looked at an alternative scheme, which the ramp itself remains the same. But what happens in this instance is this section here is extended further along, and then that will then provide the guard railing that is needed at the top of the access ramp in this location. And in doing that you need a much wider opening to create the access through from the stairs, etc. Members are being so that creates a sort of members clarification. That's a 4.8 meter wide opening. Members are being asked to determine whether the provision of a handrail in this location is so fundamental to the design of the scheme that it requires the wider opening, which obviously has the knock-on effect of having a detrimental impact upon the enclosure provided by the existing walling and the setting of the wall, etc. So this is the sort of the asymmetric of the same thing. As you can see, this central feature here is extended along to the top of the ramp, so there is a guard railing at the top of the ramp and in this location here. Essentially, what this drawing shows is this is the extent of the sort of where the guard railing is. And then I thought it'd be useful just to run through what the inspector said at the inquiry. Many members were there, so they'll be aware of what was discussed, etc. But during the public inquiry, the applicant submitted a range of solutions, and it culminated in a ramped access gradient of 1 to 115 and 5 metre sections. And the inspector said that scheme meets the requirements contained within the published guidance of the British Standard. In paragraph 101 of the report, the inspector goes on to say that whilst the full ramp gradient of 1 in 15, even with intermediate landings, may be too much for the manual wheel users, the levels, available space and potential archaeological constraints suggest a solution with a notably shallow gradient is unlikely to be achievable, and that the appellant can do no more than provide the shallowest gradient that's feasible within the constraints of the site. The inspector concluded by saying that the above ramped outcome will provide an acceptable access for able-bodied persons accessing student accommodation and would comply and meet the requirements of the Equalities Act. The options that are being considered before you are broadly in line, or are in line in terms of the gradients. They follow the same gradient that's set out in the inspector's comments here, 1 in 115. And as I say, the difference between the two sites is that the first option doesn't provide a guard railing at the top of the landing, and the second option does. Members are asking to determine whether that is of significance and is fundamental to the success of the proposals, and in doing so, whether they're happy to accept. Well, if you accept that, then you will need to accept the fact that the wall will be widened. We do have some drawings, that sort of early drawings showing how it works. These drawings, this is for option 2. This shows the 5 metre ramp section going in here, gradient to 1 in 15. You then have landing areas, and you have another section of 5 metre section moving up into the main landing to the wall area, and then again you've got another ramp section broken into 5 metre sections with landings. So that complies with the building regulations in terms of lengths of ramps and gradients, etc. I think I'll stop there and see what. Well, I'm sure members do have many questions to ask.
Thank you. I appear to have disappeared completely from view. If members would hold on for just a moment, I will leave and re-enter the room, if I may. Hello, right, thank you. Thank you, Alistair. Could Simon please address the committee, please? Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, good evening, members. This is obviously a very complex technical issue that is before you, and that really is why we referred this to you.
Am I hearing Simon?
Oh. Can you hear me, members? Or
yeah,
you can hear him.
Yes, we can all hear you loud and clear.
Can you hear me, Chairman?
I can now, thank you. Yes, I've just altered the settings. Thank you. Please proceed, Simon. Sorry.
Apologies, Chair. Yes, I was just commenting the very complex nature of the issue that is before you this evening. And that really is why officers have referred this for a steer in terms of the priorities, weighting you wish to be applied in this, taking this forward in terms of how officers will address discharging condition 15, which relates to the provision of the access through the wall. We're obviously acutely aware of the sensitivities that surround this in terms of equality of access, which is important to everybody, and clearly of corporate and statutory significance. In terms of the options that are before you this evening, they have been achieved through the involvement of 2 highly qualified and experienced access consultants. So not only have the applicants provided consultancy input, the council have employed their own independent expert consultant, as Alastair explained, to advise us in this very complex issue. Both of the ramps are identical in terms of their gradient at 1 to 15, and our access consultant advises us that that is acceptable in terms of providing an equitable and equality of access. And Alastair showed on screen paragraph 101 of the inspector's decision, which basically in essence states that in his opinion, an access ramp at a gradient of 1 in 15 does comply with the Equalities Act and does therefore provide a satisfactory means of access in principle. In terms of the options before you this evening, referred to as options 2 and 3, as Alastair has explained, 1 provides a ramp with an arrangement at the stair head where the stairs join the top of the ramp, which does not provide a guardrail in front of the user of the facility. If one was standing at the top of that flight of stairs, one would in effect have nothing in front of one, preventing anybody from effectively going forward down that flight of stairs. However, obviously, there is one would hope that the user could turn to their right and use the ramped facility. Option 3 provides for a different relationship between the stair head and the top of the access ramp, insofar as the user is faced with a guardrail and an extended zone between the corresponding ramps, which would in effect preclude the option of a user falling down that flight of stairs from the junction of the ramp and the stairway. The implications of that approach are that the opening through the wall is required to be increased to a width of 4.8 meters. As Alastair explained, this is a Victorian wall. It isn't on the alignment of the historic town wall, but it does give a sense of enclosure, which is considered to contribute positively to the character and appearance of the conservation area. However, the actual intrinsic significance of that fabric as a Victorian wall is much lower and of much lesser significance, obviously, than the nationally important historic town wall of Colchester. So officers are seeking a steer from members this evening in how they pursue further negotiations to achieve a detailed ramped access to provide a satisfactory means of inclusive access from Priory Street north into whatever development it is that would occupy the land to the north. We are acutely aware of the sensitivities that surround this. and consequently felt before we embarked on any further negotiation, we wish to have a steer from you as members to guide us in terms of the weight that you apply to either achieving fully gold-plated, if you like, accessible and inclusive access ramp, or alternatively, a slight compromise with, in terms of the guard railing, with a much lesser width of access, namely 2.2 meters through the former theatre wall. We've obviously got those drawings. Alistair's displayed them for you. We can go back to those. The legislation is incredibly complex and pulls in different directions in many ways. And it is for you to decide which particular competing interest you wish to give the greatest weight to. And consequently, the report is before you. It doesn't relate to the determination of a planning application. We do not have a formal submission of details to be agreed in compliance with condition 15 yet before us. And consequently, before we embarked on any further negotiation, we wish to have a strong steer from you members as to your intentions in this matter, having regard to the strengths of opinion that were expressed at the planning committee meeting at the time of the determination of the alumni application. So over to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Simon, one small point. Could you reassure the committee that in offering what is essentially an opinion, we are not setting a precedent and binding either ourselves or any future planning committee? So should an application arrive very much similar to what the committee may decide, it will be treated on its own merits and will not bind the planning committee.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, what we're actually looking towards is a submission of details to be agreed in compliance with condition 15. That wouldn't be an application upon which consultations would normally be carried out. It's normal national planning practice for applications in discharge or rather in compliance with conditions to be determined or having regard to their technical merits and compliance with the condition, rather because they aren't a formal planning application, they are submission of details in compliance. That's a very subtle point, but that explains why I think some of the those making representations this evening were confused as to why an application hadn't been posted on the website and consultations carried out. Normally consultations would be carried out internally on details submitted in to be agreed in compliance with conditions. They wouldn't be carried out in terms of consulting with the public for their views and opinions. They would be determined on their technical merits, if that makes any sense. In terms of being bound by the decision this evening, I think officers are seeking direction in terms of the weighting which members would wish to be applied to the consideration of any application for approval of details in compliance with condition 15. And as such, I don't think there's anything to be bound by per se, but rather to give a strong steer as to the approach which members wish to be taken in terms of condition 15 and in terms of the advice that you have received from consultants acting on behalf of the local planning authority, giving us expert guidance on this very tricky issue of accessibility and inclusive access.
Thank you very much, Simon. I will now run through each of the committee members and ask them for their views. Councillor Barton, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I do feel we're being put in an impossible position here, as there are only two options on the table. Now, option 2, I couldn't possibly support, as it obviously has real safety implications. And I'm not convinced actually that the ramp would be accessible to all wheelchair users, but I'm going to wait to see what Councillor Oxford has to say. So that leaves us with option 3. In order to make it safe, it requires a very wide opening to be made in the Victorian theatre wall. Now, I know you're saying it's not the Roman wall. I know it isn't, but it is a significant part of Colchester's history. And I feel it would harm the core historic area, in my opinion. It alters the nature of the area, the sense of enclosures destroyed. And so on heritage grounds, I'm not happy with that option either. So I don't quite know where I go now. I'm also not happy that it's actually come to committee because it's not a planning application and our role is to determine planning applications. So I'll leave it there at the moment and see what others say, but both options don't impress me at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Barton. Councillor Chua, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, this is a very technical and complex, issue, very tricky for us to decide as well. My main concern on these ramps is I want to make sure that it is DDA compliant and is safe for wheelchair users. And I do agree with Councillor Barton on what she has said. And I won't make any decisions until I hear from Councillor Oxford. Thank you.
Councillor Hazel, please.
Thank you, Chair. Like Councillor Barton, I really don't understand why this is before us this evening. I cannot support this application for the following reasons. Option 2 does not provide the necessary safety and usability elements required but by wheelchair users or sight impaired people or the elderly or otherwise disabled people. Option 3 is not acceptable because it would harm the Roman wall both visually and physically. In my opinion, option 2 does breach the Equalities Act 2020. For example, it states it should eliminate discrimination, advance equality and opportunity, and foster good relations between different peoples when carrying out their activities. If vulnerable people cannot access the campus or hotel users, then they would be very discriminated against. The Grampian decision is, in my opinion, a distraction and not relevant. At 4.7 on the agenda, it states at bullet point 3, it mentions the BS 8300, section 8.223. It's titled Protection from Falling, where there is a change in level between the access route and the surrounding area. The risk of falling should be assessed and appropriate measures should be taken to address this. At 4.8, it states that option 2 fails to meet the standard with regard to the risk of falling, as it does not have complete guarding to the turning area at the landing of the steps to the lower level. This is not acceptable. Option 3 shows a planter as providing guarding to the turning area at the landing and therefore meets the recommendation in the standard. Seriously? At 4.9, the discussion is on the opinion of Historic England and the Council's Internal Heritage Advisor. In my opinion, Historic England is talking about access to a monument whereby it can be seen that not every place would be accessible to everybody. This application is dealing with a modern application and it is to accommodation and a hotel whereby it can be, and it's not an ancient monument. The criteria for access must be different. This at 4.10, it states inter alia, it is an important principle that everybody should have a dignified access to and within the scheme. I cannot see anything dignified in subjecting vulnerable people to the unsafe access this ramp would provide. Policy DP1, in my opinion, it fails that at small 1, 2 and 4. I can read those out if you would wish. It also fails, in my opinion. You are too. And Chair, furthermore, I would like to add, at last night's full council meeting, I was rather dismayed to hear Councillor King's response to a question put by Councillor Gocher, who had been asked by a resident, why was the council going ahead with this? His reply that CBC had a commitment to Alumno plus £40 million and jobs, he would see it through. Chair, such remarks undermine and compromise the ability of the Planning Committee to independently carry out the lawful duties without fear or favour. Public confidence on planning's impartiality has been seriously compromised by Councillor King's determination to ensure this particular development goes through, irrespective of members' opinions. And having said that, I would like to thank Simon Cairns for his more measured explanations to us this evening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hazel. Alistair, would you like to reply to those, please? If you could unmute yourself, Alistair, please.
So I hadn't said anything, I was just thinking what to say.
Oh, sorry.
I think going back to first basics, I think is probably the best thing to start with. The St Botolph's Master Plan dates from 2004 or whenever, indicates the council accepts or wants an access from the Priory Street level through to the development site to the north of the town wall. With the council, as the inspector said at the public inquiry, has therefore nailed the colours to the mast in that sense and has accepted there will be some breach of the wall in terms of loss of fabric, whatever that may take. The inspector discussed at quite some detail and length at the inquiry and listened to various objectors and the applicants and all the appellants in that stage and the council's consultants over how this access should be provided. And the inspector was quite clear in his statement that he feels that the latest reiteration of the scheme that was tabled at the meeting, at the inquiry, provided an acceptable solution in terms of the ramp gradients, etc., and that the detailing could be controlled through an appropriately worded condition 15, and that's where we are, trying to ensure that, trying to ascertain with members what weighting should be given between the extent of the opening in the wall and whether that should be kept as narrow as possible. And if we do that, then that means there's a guard railing at the top, where there is a slight difference of opinion between the consultants as to how fundamental that is to the accessibility and safety of the scheme between the consultants, and whether we have a wider opening, which would then comply with the British Standard recommendations and therefore be in adherence to the requirements of the condition. But in accepting that, officers and members would need to accept that necessitates a much wider opening in the theatre wall. So I think that's all I can really say, because it's the weighting what you want to give. Do we want to keep the wall opening as narrow as possible, or do you want, if the guard railing is considered fundamental to the success of the scheme in terms of accessibility and safety of the users, then option 3 is the solution that needs to be adopted. Both schemes, given the way the British Standard is worded, would comply with the British Standard. Option 3 provides, as I say, the hand railing and an additional safety feature, but that safety feature has been risk assessed by the applicant and is considered that the scheme would be safe without it. So I say there are two choices. The condition requires compliance with the British standard. Both comply, and it's whether members feel the guard railing, say, is fundamental to the safe use of the scheme, in which case you need to opt for option 3. If there's a question mark whether you don't believe that is necessarily the case, then it's option 2. I mean, what I would say is if an application is submitted, then both schemes would comply with the requirements of the recommendation, and it would be very difficult for officers to refuse it on the basis that it's non-compliance. And if they were to refuse it, then we'd end up with an appeal and no doubt being deemed to act unreasonably, particularly in the light of the inspector's comments over the gradient and being acceptable, etc. I think that's all I can say for the moment.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Councillor Moore, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mine is I've been looking at this and puzzling. Is the ground plan of the ramps option 2 and option 3 the same, or is option 3 bigger? Because I know a bit about geometry. If you make the final landing, was it 4 feet to the left, then the ramp to get to it must be correspondingly steeper. But we have been told that the ramp gradients are the same. Can somebody explain that? Because it doesn't make sense to me.
Is that your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. If I can move on, thank you very much. If Alistair, if we do it in 3s, then Alistair can come back to that one. Councillor Loveland, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, how can I add any more to what Councillor Hazel said? She's done a great job. I think Councillor Oxford has got more expertise on this than anything. Anything I'd like to know is what has changed from the original applicant when we sent it back the first time. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McLean, please.
I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the way it's come about and the way it's come to us, but I think we've got to be mindful of the decisions we've got to make regarding this application. With the Roman town, we're in a very awkward narrative with how we go about these Roman walls and how we get access, because really the access is, a major facility for the residents and the visitors to the town. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm not sure which one to go with because they're all very similar, but we're in a rock and a hard place, I think.
All right, thank you very much. Alistair, if you could, answer Councillor Moore's question if you have your calculator handy.
No, the ramps stay the same. All that has happened is when you get to the top of the ramp where the plant is sort of extended, the stairs are shunted to the west, in effect, so that the landing at the top is just longer. The actual ramps don't change in terms of the gradient or the lengths. It's the landing area where that is increased in size. It is that facilitates the extra room to put in the guardrail or the planter to prevent falling from the top. I mean, what question was asked? What has changed since members last refused the application? Well, it's been subject to a public inquiry, and the inspector has found the proposal acceptable, and he discussed at length, the merits of the access. He was at the inquiry. He was slightly perplexed that there was a design that people were saying that we shouldn't have an access through this site, yet the council's own guidance suggests there should be an access through, and there's a clear conflict between providing an access and the town wall stroke underlying heritage, and that the inspector's view was that it's a scheme that's been, the principle's been promoted by the council, and therefore some change has to be accepted in this location. And in terms of impacts of the specific design, the inspector was quite clear that the proposal that was last tabled at the inquiry, which showed a sort of a similar scheme to what's now proposed under option 2, or a less refined scheme that was proposed under option 2, provided an acceptable solution in principle, but the detailing would need to be brought out in terms of the detailed design, hence the condition. And I also think it's important to remember that at present, if you are a disabled user or any user in parking in Priory Street car park, you need to walk along Priory Street to Queen Street, where the footpath is narrow and unusable if you have a pushchair, pram, wheelchair, etc. So you're almost forced out into the road in that location. And then you have to then turn into Queen Street and get up a steep hill. The inspector was clear in his decision letter that is an awkward and route for people with impaired mobility or pushchairs, etc., to take. And the solution that was proposed at the inquiry provided an improved circumstance. He also said that you need to be mindful of this is one access point into the site. This is not the only point, and there are alternative access points that can be used to access the site at the time. Now, Councillor Oxford was obviously at the inquiry, and I know he spoke passionately about the requirements to comply with the Equalities Act and the length of the ramps, etc. As I say, the inspector obviously took those on board, and he made an assessment as to what was deemed acceptable. So we are where we are, so to speak, and we need to try and grapple with the current proposal and work out whether option 1 or option 2 is the best solution that is on offer, and on the basis that both of them meet the British standard in terms of their requirement. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Alistair. Councillor Oxford, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sure Rowena, who's listening to this on YouTube, and I are absolutely great to be called a principal. Disabled people are a principal now. That's a new one for me. So I'm absolutely delighted for that one. This is a nightmare, complete nightmare. And unfortunately, it's our nightmare. Let me give, for instance, if you go into the Equalities Act and you type in what is the grade, the most suitable gradient for an outside ramp, and they say 1 in 20. But they say you can provide a 1 in 15 with landings, which is what's provided here. The issue is here, as soon as they say that, and I've looked at all the legislation, I've been on their websites and I've spoken to them, and they always caveat it with, and I'll read it out, it says 4 ramps, 1 in 15 gradient, even with intermediate landings, may be too much for some manual wheelchair users, right? So I then spoke to the people in London about the Equalities Act and what that meant. And I was told emphatically that wording alone is direct discrimination against disabled people, because the Act states when any disabled person is treated less favourably because of their condition, then that's discrimination. That's what these ramps do. You can only say, it says, may not be suitable for all manual wheelchair users to use it. Therefore, if any one of them can't use it, it's discrimination. Plain and simple. Option 2 provides a ski jump without the railings at the top. I'd like to know whether or not we actually get points for the amount of injuries or deaths if you came off at option 2 at the top of the stairs, because I can see quite a few manual wheelchair users who would end up at the bottom of them. I've seen many in my day where they're not brilliant with their manual wheelchairs, and they're even less brilliant when they've got suitcases and everything else they are supposed to get up them ramps. Sorry, it infuriates me. We are constantly, as a disabled community, told oh, yes, you matter. And then when it comes down to decisions, no, you don't, basically. When we had the original application, Essex County Highways, as the statutory consultee, stated that the pedestrian access out onto Queen Street was too dangerous. The inspector fudged that one at the appeal. Today, I drove down from Priory Street round to Lewis Gardens to check what the dimensions were, because the only other route would be down Priory Street, up East Hill and into Lewis Gardens. And that's 0.5 of a mile, half a mile. You know, it's great. You pull along behind you trolleys with, you know, one with your casters on and other bits and pieces going behind, a bit like a train. It's really good. It's very fun. I just think, well, if it wasn't so important, it's a joke. And I sometimes wonder, and I'd love to hear what Rowena would think about it. I mean, she's a manual wheelchair user, quite an able one, but she knows many who are less able, and so do I, and they would struggle to cope with these proposal of ramps in that format. Jesus. We've got the last night at full council, we voted on the strategic plan and the heritage element of it. We should scrap it because we don't have one. You know, if we are saying as a council we want to bodge a hole into the wall in order to gain access to Priory Street, just so a developer can line their pockets and put some stupid block up on the top, then that's wrong. And we're not in favour of heritage at all. So we've just okayed something that we don't give a damn about in reality. I'm probably going to get in trouble after this, but I really don't care. As far as I'm concerned, when we're talking about access and legislation to do with the Equalities Act and the DDA component within it, we're talking about people's lives, how they can live or not live their lives easier. And we're not making it easier at all. So from personally, I mean, obviously everybody else can do exactly what they like. That's what it's all about. But personally, I can't vote for either of these because I'm either voting for a car that's got a knife in 3 of the tyres, or I've got a car with knife in 2 of the tyres. And then, you know, you drive down the road and say, which one of them is going to blow first? Sorry, it's useless. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Oxford. Councillor Warnes, please.
Well, follow that. Okay. For me, the watchwords for me are dignity, safety, and also trying to maintain a sense of enclosure. So enclosure of the wall. I understand the points that Gerard is making about the 1.5 gradient, and a 1 in 20 would be better. And there are limitations, so we're being advised about what can be achieved on the site. And therefore, a reasonable response doesn't seem an unreasonable stance to actually take. Whether or not a 1.5 gradient as opposed to a 1 in 20 is reasonable, I don't feel qualified to really form an opinion on that, but I do give weight to the planning officer's view that there are limitations as to what can be achieved and that the British standards are guidance. However, any access for me has to not only be a safe access that I'll come to in a bit, but it has to be a dignified access as well. And what this does do is it would create an access for people living with disabilities that not only goes onto the site, but would go through to the town. And at the moment, they're being asked to, as Gerard say, take a rather elongated route or to walk, as the planning officer had said, down Priory Street on a really unsuitable piece of pavement. So they have to go into the road and turn right and go up a slope into Queen Street. So this, in one sense, does provide a dignified access for people who are living with disabilities. And therefore, that is an important principle. And as I've stated, it does go through to the town and not just onto the site. So it is giving people living with disabilities in one term, a dignified access into the town. Whether the gradient is enough or not, we're being told it may be, on the one hand, by the officer's opinion, and Gerard, who has experience of living with disabilities, is saying that it doesn't. But in terms of the options of breaching the wall, for me, I think it's safety first for me, and I'm uneasy about putting a wheelchair user in a position where they are facing a set of stairs rather than offset where they are facing an actual handrail and a wall. So therefore, I would see that as important to me, and in considering option 3, I would give that weight. I would also recognise the advice we've been given, which is of the lesser significance of the Victorian wall. And I understand it is what's left of what was formerly a theatre, but it is set forward from the line of the Roman wall, which is the ancient monument. But I do also recognise that in its current form, it does create a sense of enclosure, whereas a 4 metre breach would actually diminish this. So I'm minded towards option 3, but what I would like to say is that I'd like to see a recommendation that the 4 metre breach in the wall is actually arched, because I think that would help maintain a sense of enclosure when visually looking at what's left of the old external wall of the old Victorian theatre. Now, I can imagine that some people might say there's a danger that people might climb on it and fall, but I think that danger is still there, even if you have a smaller breach or a wider breach. And I think it is within the wit of, architects and planners to come up with a scheme for an arch that would actually mitigate those risks. So I would be happy to make a recommendation of accepting option 3 with a further recommendation that the 4 metre breach in the wall be arched in order to maintain a sense of enclosure.
Thank you very much, Councillor Warnes. I'd like to echo much of what you have said in your rather magisterial statements. I mean, to me, this is all about people, and it's all about access to places for everybody. And obviously, safety first must be the priority. And I do feel that regardless of whatever happens on the land behind Priory Street, whether it's a Lumno or any other development, there must be some form of access there. The access around Queen Street is abysmal. It's, well, I'll leave it at that. But I think something would have to be done, and something really should have been thought about perhaps years ago, but we are where we are. And also, I think it does actually improve the Priory Street car park, because I understand that from the drawings, the wall and the sycamore tree will be removed, making a continuous site. I have consulted my daughter, who works with adults with learning disabilities and spends much of her life pushing wheelchairs around, and she has come down very firmly in favour of option 3. So I'll be guided by her. The only recommendation there is that there should be more viewing slots. As well as obviously a thought given to an archway. So having expressed our views, does any committee member have any further views or thoughts, comments, observations? Councillor Oxford, please.
Chairman, I liken this application to if we were to remove carbon monoxide items out of a house so everybody can get poisoned while they're in bed. It's okay to kill some disabled people or injure them, and we'll say, oh well, we'll try and do something for them, but we have to make do and mend. There is no such thing as make do or mend. It's either safe or it isn't safe. And according to, as I say, according to the Equalities Act itself, it says to be completely safe, it's 1 in 20. It's not our fault there isn't the space in Priory Street. It's not our fault. It should have been thought of yonks ago, and they shouldn't have been selling that land for that development or anything else that couldn't accommodate its own parking on that site. They did it, and this is where we're at. Sorry, there you go.
Thank you, Councillor Oxford. Actually, earlier on today, I did have a conversation with Simon about this and about the possibility of a 1 in 20. I don't know whether you want to talk to us about that, Simon, whether it is possible to acquire some land from the Priory Street car park. It is, after all, owned by CBC, so something is possible there.
Excuse me, Chair. In terms of the it being within the realms of possibility, I don't know whether what the council corporately, their attitude would be towards increasing the land take for a ramp. Obviously, the council has a huge commitment to creating accessibility for all and equality in all aspects of living in our historic town. So I would imagine, in principle, if a further land take could facilitate that may be looked on positively. I can't obviously speak for the council, I don't know. As you say, and you've noted, the removal of the wall and the sycamore tree does improve circulation considerably at the base of the ramp. I think Alistair may wish to comment in terms of the red line site area and whether this is achievable within the application site in compliance with the condition 15. It is something we could take back and investigate. Indeed, that's the very purpose of referring this. I think several members have questioned why this has been referred to them at this very early stage. And it is for this very reason that officers were acutely aware of the sensitivity of this issue and really wished to deliver members' aspirations in terms of the weighting that they would afford to these competing issues. And that's why it's before you, before there is an application, so that you wouldn't feel that the wrong approach was being taken, an approach which you wouldn't wish to support. So in terms of Councillor Liddy, we can go back We can again ask for a 1 in 20 ramped option to be investigated. I don't know that it's achievable. I think we have tried to achieve the very best solution within the space available. If that space were to be increased, then it may be possible that a 1 in 20 ramp could be achieved. I simply don't know. But if that's the message you wish us to take back, then that is the purpose of putting this item on the agenda, to gain a really strong steer from you as to your aspirations for the form of this ramp.
Thank you very much, Simon. Now, just for clarity for committee members, under the terms of reference of the Planning Committee 2.4, we may determine any other matters as may from time to time require determination by the committee. So it is within our remit. Now, I have Councillor Moore, followed by Councillor McLean and Councillor Hazel. Councillor Moore, please.
Thank you. I don't quite know how we propose to resolve our general opinions on this, but I can give you my opinion, which is that neither of the options that we've been presented with are acceptable. Now, if that requires a proposition to turn them down, I'm prepared to do that. Or if this because it's not a planning decision, maybe it has to be handled a different way. But if you need someone to propose that both of the options are unacceptable, then I'm prepared to do that. Thank you.
I think before I move on to Councillor McLean, I think subject to Richard's advice on the subject, I simply propose to go through each member and just say yes, no, and keep it as simple as that, without the need for a formal resolution. Otherwise it does become formal. Just ask. So if you're happy with that. Councillor McLean, please.
So what, a yes or a no, or I can say something?
You could say something, you could say what you like within reason.
Oh, it'd be like that. I'm just thinking, I support what Councillor Moore has said, but Simon Cairns has said he's more than happy to go back to have a think about it. He doesn't think it may come to any fruition on what he's thinking, but maybe we should re-look at this, and I think we need to have a bit of a brainstorming on it. There must be another way round it. It might be more costly, but there must be a way round it to make it acceptable and DDA compliant and, you know, user friendly for anybody and everyone that comes into our town.
Thank you. Councillor Hazel, did you want to come in?
No, Chair, I'm happy to wait for the vote such as it is.
I don't propose to take a vote. I mean,
Chairman, could I perhaps come in? Chairman, you have a report before you which has effectively invites you to make a decision, and the decision that's written in the report suggests an endorsement of option 2. I would suggest that if you've been invited to give your opinion as a committee on the proposals in front of you, you've obviously got a number of options open to you, either endorsing options 2 or options 3. And Simon Cairns has also indicated a further option of perhaps some further investigation and further discussions. I would suggest that, given the feelings and the strength of feeling of the committee, that you do take some form of recommendation and take a vote on the matter.
All right, I'll be guided by you on that one. I think, well, the recommendation is, if I've got this correctly, hold on. To endorse the suggested approach to the creation of a new pedestrian access from Priory Street as set out in the report, namely that of option 2.
Chairman, could I just intervene before anything's taken, just to clarify the red line site boundary issue?
Yeah, please. Yes, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Simon made reference to exploring the option of a 1 in 20 ramp that has been looked at as within the red line site boundary and has not been proved to be feasible. I hear what members say about exploring land swaps, takes, or how you want to describe it, but obviously that falls outside the scope of this current application. It's important to remember that we do have an extant permission that the developer is seeking to implement, and the condition is quite clear that it requires a ramp, if it is provided, to be in accordance with the British standard. Now, I'm obviously aware of the strength of feeling regarding whether the 1 in 15 ramp is acceptable or otherwise, but ultimately that complies with the British standard, and that's the requirement of the condition. The condition doesn't attach it to any other form of standard ideal ramp gradient or weather. The requirement is it has to be designed in accordance with the British standard. So I hear there could be a discussion off to the side about, if we give you some more land, can you create a better or an alternative a shallower gradient ramp? That's fine. But in terms of this application, you need to remember it is an exam permission and they're implementing it within the red line site boundary in accordance with the inspector's condition. Now, obviously, if we're unhappy with the condition and whether it's legally required, we're now past the state of the judicial review and there's no scope for legal challenge. So we are stuck with the condition and implementing that condition. So I just feel that's important to raise.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, you're absolutely correct. We are where we are on that one, but at this particular meeting, we are simply asked to proffer an opinion. We have a recommendation. We have one proposer to reject. Do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Oxford. Okay, we'll go through the motion and vote on it. Jan,
sorry, Chairman. Can I just clarify the terms of the motion that you're voting on? That's to refuse both approaches.
No, simply the recommendation. I think I get the sense of the meeting that we could be here for a very long time if we started amending it and doing other things and changing the basic recommendation. It could be rather a lengthy meeting and probably not a very fruitful one. I think the fact that we've been given this recommendation, we take a view on it, and the officers go away, and and we will have to take the next stages forward. Councillor Moore, please.
Sorry to be pedantic, but if we vote not to accept the recommendation, does that infer that we do accept the alternative? That's what I'm slightly bothered about. Do we fall out of one camp into another one, or does option, if we're opting to turn down option 2, does that mean we are obliged to take option 3? Because if neither are acceptable, that particular choice is unacceptable.
I think, subject to what Richard says, in my view, we're only turning down option 2. That is all we're asked to do, to accept or reject it. Option 3 doesn't even come into it. Is that a fair interpretation? Perhaps Simon, you'd like to?
Yes, I mean, I'd obviously defer to Richard in terms of the issues of voting, but I would have thought if you reject option 2, you could then have another vote on whether you wish to accept option 3. And you could obviously then decide to reject option 3 as well. But I do take the point that Councillor Moore raised, but I don't think it's an automatic matter at all, that if you reject option 2, you're not automatically accepting option 3. However, obviously the recommendation of your officers is that option 3 could be acceptable if you decide that your priorities are to achieve total compliance with the BS 8300 in terms of the guard railing and the safety issue that Councillor Oxford set out so eloquently.
All right. Thank you very much for that. Richard, do you want to come in?
I think I would agree with Simon's interpretation that if you refuse option 2, you're not binding yourself to option 3. But if you wanted to express a view on option 3 with a further vote, that might be sensible.
All right, if that's the sense of the meeting, then fine. All right, Jan, would you care to go through the roll call, please?
Yes, of course. So
This is for the first one for option 2.
Yes,
Yeah.
for option 2. Councillor Barton?
Against.
Councillor Chua?
Against.
Councillor Hazel?
Against.
Councillor Loveland?
Yes, against.
Councillor McLean?
Against.
Councillor Moore?
Against.
Councillor Oxford?
Against.
Councillor Warnes?
Against.
Councillor Liddy?
Against.
Okay, so that's unanimous for option 2. So option 3, Councillor Barton?
Against.
Sorry, Councillor Warnes, did you want to say something?
Oh, Councillor Warnes. Did I not ask?
Sorry.
No, it's not that. I would like to say something if I could, Chair, please.
Sorry.
I said I would like to say something if I could, please.
Yes, please do. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, Jan.
Yes, we seem to be moving automatically onto accepting or rejecting option 3. But I did say that I felt what was before us was pragmatic within the bounds of what was possible, and I would like to recommend option 3 with a further recommendation that an arched breach in the wall is provided. So I did actually put that, so I didn't feel it was right that we should move straight to voting yes or no on option 3 without you testing whether there's a seconder for that or not.
Do I have a seconder for Councillor Warnes' proposal? Well, I will second it. Okay, Councillor McLean, please. You wanted to say something.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, it's all very well, but we're changing a Roman wall here, a relic that's going to be changed out of all recognition with the arch. So should we be implementing? Sorry?
Victorian wall.
Okay, should we be putting an arch in there? That's all I was very worried about,
No,
because we're going to be changing the whole outlook of the wall, and I'm not sure if that's correct to do that in that respect. That's all I was coming back for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, we now have a proposal on the table from Councillor Warnes and seconded by me. If you, Jan, if you care to go through the roll.
Okay, so it's option 3 with the addition of an arch. Councillor Barton?
Against.
Councillor Chua?
Against.
Councillor Hazel?
Against.
Councillor Loveland?
Against.
Councillor McLean?
Against.
Councillor Moore?
You're muted, Councillor Moore.
Pardon me. Against.
Councillor Oxford?
Sorry, against.
Thank you. Councillor Warnes?
For.
For. Councillor Liddy?
For.
So that's 7 against and 2 for.
The motion falls. Right, well, I mean, I think we've done this subject to death now, and I think you've probably got more than enough material to go away, the officers that is, to think about. And we will now move on, if I may. Item number 9, applications in accordance with the officer scheme of delegation. There's a report before you of those items that have been determined in such a way. Do we have any comments or observations? Do we want to have a presentation on it, or are we quite happy to accept it?
No, accept it.
All right, Jan, if you'd care to read out the school roll quickly.
Okay, Councillor Barton?
For.
Councillor Chua?
For.
Councillor Hazel?
4.
Councillor Loveland.
Yes, 4.
Councillor
4.
Flynn. Thank you. Councillor Moore.
4.
Councillor Oxford. Councillor Oxford.
I missed that. My 2 dogs went hurtling down the stairs. 4.
Sorry. 4. Okay. Councillor Warnes.
4.
Thank you. That's carried. Oh, Councillor Liddy, sorry.
4.
Can I just, sorry, I can't find my hand thing. Could I just
Karen,
check that
please.
includes the additional items on the amendment sheet as well, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Confirmed. And I believe that concludes the business for this evening. Thank you very much, and I now declare the meeting closed.
Ooh.
And thank you very much for your time and your patience, and for a very, very informed debate. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good
all.
night.
Good night.
Night all.